Ask anyone who has ever lived in a river valley, and they will confirm that flooding is a regular occurrence in them. The Connecticut River Valley that creates part of the New Hampshire-Vermont border is no exception to this rule. But the floods of early summer 1984 seemed sent by God to wash away the valley's innocence. Several roads were closed and travel was difficult, even for the 10-minute drive from the county nursing home in Unity to Bernice Courtmanche's home in Beauregard Village. Bonnie Spencer gave Bernice a ride home where she planned to get a snack and change before hitchhiking the 10 miles to Newport to meet her boyfriend Teddy Barry at his sister's place. Teddy's parents, Arthur and Janet, stopped in while Bernice was eating her snack and offered her a ride. She refused, saying she'd get one easily enough. When it got dark and Bernice still wasn't at Teddy's sister's house, Teddy started to worry. Eventually, Teddy and Robert, his sister's husband, drove around looking for Bernice. When they couldn't find her, they decided she'd turn up the next day. When she hadn't shown up by noon the next day, they reported her missing. A 17-year-old high school student who worked full-time as a nurse's aide isn't the type to go missing willingly, especially on Memorial Day weekend in 1984. A sheet metal worker reported seeing Bernice getting into a white pickup truck with 2 or 3 guys in front of Frank's neighborhood store on North Street, obviously on her way to Newport. A teacher reported that Bernice wasn't part of the in crowd, but also was no loner. She certainly didn't seem as if she'd want to do any harm to herself. Over the days and weeks following her disappearance, sightings of Bernice steadily trickled into the police. One from a man who didn't know what Bernice looked like, another from a woman who confused dates and saw Bernice before she went missing. In early July, another woman would go missing from the same small town. We'll get to that right after my overly obnoxious trigger warning. Roll the intro. In March of 1982, Ellen Freed was a senior nursing student in upstate New York. She knew this chapter of her life would be ending soon and she'd be moving away to start her own adult life. She graduated in June but didn't start interviewing for jobs until after her 25th birthday in August. She interviewed all over New Hampshire and Vermont. Ellen wanted to work and live a simple country life. Eventually, she accepted a position at Valley Regional Hospital in Claremont, New Hampshire. By New Year's Day 1983, she was moving into her permanent residence on Chestnut Street. The only thing between Ellen's residence and Sugar Creek was Monadnock Park. In July of 1984, her aging Chevelle was seen parked along the little-traveled dirt road named Jarvis Lane by a patrol officer. It attracted little attention until the next day. When an officer went to check the owner's home, she had moved out a couple months earlier and left no forwarding address. Then, 2 nurses called in from Valley Regional Hospital to report that Ellen Freed had not shown up for work on Friday and Saturday, which was very out of character for her. A hasty search of the area around her vehicle turned up nothing unusual. Using borrowed ATVs and a bloodhound, police began a thorough search of the area. By Tuesday, over 30 professionals were searching for Ellen. By Wednesday afternoon, the entire area had been searched to no avail. A dark-complected, brown-haired man had been seen driving Ellen's vehicle with a canoe strapped to the top. A week after her disappearance, flyers appeared showing a picture of Ellen and appealing for information. Handwritten appeals for information appeared on the town's bulletin boards as well. Ellen's family told police that she had called her sister after work on Thursday night. She called from a payphone outside Leo's Market on Main Street, Claremont. Near the end of the conversation, Ellen told Heidi, her sister, it was odd that a car was driving through the lot without stopping. Then Ellen started her car before hanging up the phone just to make sure it started. 3 weeks after her disappearance, friends from work found Aram Nasoglu, Ellen's boyfriend. It turns out he was the one driving around with the canoe on the roof. Police and the media had not connected these two cases. Psychologist John Philpin was the first to officially suspect a serial killer at work. Eva Morse was 27 years old and devoted to her 10-year-old daughter, Jenny. Eva also lived an openly lesbian lifestyle at a time and place where it was not generally accepted to do so. Lacking a high school diploma relegated the young woman to low-paying jobs. Eva managed to support herself and Jenny, but accommodations were meager and luxuries like a car completely out of reach, which is why Eva frequently hitchhiked. In 1985, Eva left Carol Wilcox, her live-in lover. She started paying more attention to her appearance, intentionally dressing more feminine, and even started dating a man. In June of 1985, Eva gave Jenny an expensive 10-speed bicycle for her birthday, a gift Eva had saved long and hard for. 3 weeks later, Charleston police called Eva's brother-in-law asking him if he had seen the missing woman. Eva's sister, Noreen, immediately knew something bad happened. Eva would never leave Jenny without arranging for her care. Eva had left for work, hitchhiked the 8 miles to the J.H. Dunning box factory, arrived at work, but left feeling ill before punching in. A co-worker reported that Eva was going to see Carol Wilcox. Some reported Eva being depressed. A friend recalled Eva talking about going to Connecticut for training to obtain a higher-paying job. Others reported Eva leaving without providing care for Jenny before. A general sentiment of Eva's irresponsibility led people to think Eva left by choice. But not Noreen, who spent $14.80, which is just over $40 in today's money, to place an ad in a local paper seeking information about Eva. This prompted the paper to run a front-page story about Eva. The Eagle Times started asking about links between Eva's and Ellen Freed's cases. You remember Ellen, right? The lead investigator stated that they were looking along the river for clues. He also stated, "There's nothing like a car left behind in this case to give you a place to start with. It's a lot of territory to cover. And I could bring in the dogs, but where would we start?" In August, police questioned motorists outside the J.H. Dunning box plant. One driver reported seeing her hitchhiking on Washington Street 3 weeks after her disappearance. A woman reported picking Eva up in front of the plant on July 10th. She took Eva north to the Charlestown-Claremont line, where Eva continued hitchhiking north. Police focused on the differences between Eva, Bernice, and Ellen's disappearances to the point of ignoring the similarities. Philpin was connecting the dots. Carol Wilcox lived in Beauregard Village, where Bernice had lived. Beauregard Village is in West Claremont, like Leo's Market, where Ellen used the phone immediately before she disappeared. The bridge Bernice crossed shortly before her disappearance was only a mile north of Leo's Market. On a lazy Thursday in September, the police radios lit up with requests for state police, detectives, the county medical referee, and the state's attorney general's office in Newport, just outside the jurisdiction these women disappeared from. 2 men came across some bones while target shooting in the woods. Mike Praza, the Claremont chief detective, suspected this might be linked to his missing persons cases, but decided not to get involved unless and until he was invited to do so by his smaller neighbor. That evening, Arthur Bastian, the Newport police chief, called Prazo at home. The bones had been buried under an ancient hemlock tree which had fallen over. It was only 50 feet from an abandoned rail line now used for jogging by locals. This was as far as a vehicle could go into the woods. The skeletal remains were shipped to the state lab in Concord, where the work of identifying these remains would be farmed out to labs better equipped for the process. Bastian looked through some of Prazo's case files. He immediately thought the remains might belong to Ellen. 12 days later, Bastian's hunch proved to be correct. They had finally located Ellen Freed. Forensic analysis of the teeth made the conclusive identification. A forensic pathologist was unable to determine the cause of death. The Assistant Attorney General publicly declared that they were considering all options: accident, suicide, and homicide. He stated, "There are a lot of unanswered questions. Almost all the questions are unanswered." Police were convinced it was a homicide. 2 subsequent searches of the area turned up no clues. Officers painstakingly canvassed homes close to the site. Some of these people vaguely indicated that a man whose home was off a little ways might know something. The home belonged to Richard Robert Bordeau. On April 19th, 1966, less than 100 feet from Cat Hole Road, an old logging track, in the Kellyville section of Newport, just like Ellen Freed's remains, two men out fishing found the skeletal remains of a skull and upper torso in a rotting jacket. New Hampshire still lacked a medical examiner and farmed the bones out for analysis and comparison. 3 days later, the reports came in. The remains were those of Bernice Courtmanche. She was identified by the same forensic dentist that identified the remains of Ellen Freed 7 months earlier. Bernice was left just 5 miles from her home. Bernice and Ellen had disappeared just 51 days and less than a mile apart. Their remains were found less than 3 miles apart. The police chiefs of Claremont and Newport announced that they were looking into connections between the two cases with the New Hampshire State Police. After a careful autopsy of the remains, the forensic medical examiner had determined that Bernice was stabbed to death based on lesions in the neck vertebrae. This is when Mike Prozzo finally felt the innocence of Claremont, his hometown, washed away by those floods back in 1984. On April 25th, another body was found. This one was in West Unity, a small town nestled between Claremont, Newport, and Charleston. The remains once again were skeletal and farmed out to the same people who identified Bernice and Ellen. In just a couple hours, the remains were positively identified as Eva Morse. She was about 4 miles from where she was last seen hitchhiking a ride to Beauregard Village. It was also only 500 feet from where these same two loggers had found another body in 1981 in an unsolved case. With the remains of Bernice, Ellen, and Eva being found, the missing persons cases had become murder investigations. So let's get back to the only suspect we have so far. Mr. Richard Robert Bordeau. A farmhouse, a Victorian mansion, something in between the two. The Beauregard family had lived there for generations. Richard had recently inherited the property and lived there alone. The dark, foreboding home with its dark gabled front was nicknamed the Haunted House. Richard was not a stranger to the police. Virginia Troy worked at Mapleview Restaurant. Richard had applied for a cook's position. Virginia had taken his application. He did not get the job, but did start writing letters to Virginia. The letters seemed mundane, keeping up letters you might write to a friend, except each one included an appeal for Virginia to go out with Richard. Virginia was not an old friend of Mr. Beauregard. Taking his application was the only time she had spoken to him. Virginia ignored the letters until one of them suggested that she sleep with Richard, at which point she started receiving phone calls from him, too. Virginia filed an official complaint. Police called him several times and got no answer. Finally, police left Richard a note asking him to call the station. When he responded, police asked him to stop contacting Virginia. Richard agreed to do so, and the file was closed. The next day, Ellen's remains were found near his home. Neighbors reported Richard's strange behavior, walking the road late at night, talking loudly to no one, staring into neighbors' windows for long stretches, yelling unintelligible things into the night from the house's windows. One neighbor asked for regular patrols as a result. Richard did not remember his whereabouts when Freed disappeared. He ended the interview by asking police to make any further contact through written correspondence. Richard's youth was troubled. His mother had gotten him psychiatric care and medication, which he refused to take. His mother sheltered and protected him even from his own father. Richard worked intermittently, but mostly his parents supported him. Richard would visit a coffee shop alone, order 2 coffees, and proceed to hold a complete conversation with an empty chair. He pestered every woman he met for a date, ignoring their repeated requests to stop. Richard once attempted to join an all-female aerobics class. Richard's mother died in 1982 at 57 years old. Richard's grandmother died on Christmas Eve just a couple months later, and 3 weeks after that, Richard's father also died. He was alone in the house, living off of his inheritance. He got to know Ellen Freed when his mother and grandmother were patients at the hospital she worked at. Then another woman disappeared. It was a cold Sunday morning in January, and the Vermont Department of Transportation was busy trying to keep the snow cleared off of the roads and rest areas. 2 snowplow drivers were running on the highway in tandem to clear both lanes at the same time. They were also clearing the rest areas as they passed them. In one of the rest areas sat an abandoned car with the driver's door ajar. They remembered the car because they had to swerve around it. Every time they returned to plow the fresh snow from the rest area, they expected the car to be gone, but it was always still there. Eventually, they asked the attendant to call someone about the car. She called Hartford police the next morning. They called Vermont State Police, who called Ed Sunoco in White River Junction. The car was taken to the station and parked behind the building. The next morning, Toby Ferris was the attendant when he noticed a man pull a ski jacket from the dumpster. When Toby investigated, he found a ski jacket, a turtleneck sweater, and a red sweatshirt, all in good repair. He took them inside and found a wallet with an ID card for Barbara Agnew from Mary Hitchcock Memorial Hospital in the jacket. Toby tried to call the number on the card several times, but only received the answering machine. Following protocol, Toby turned the clothes into the highway department. Helen King, a tenacious state data entry clerk, was tasked with returning them to their owner. She contacted the hospital, who contacted Barbara's ex-husband, Dr. Douglas Talon. Douglas called Jane North, Barbara's best friend. Jane told Douglas that Barbara had gone skiing on Saturday with a man she met on a plane, and Jane hadn't heard from her since. When Douglas told Jane about the ID card in the wallet, a chill down her spine froze Jane in her tracks. Something had happened. Barbara would never part from her wallet willingly. Douglas and Jane filed Barbara's missing persons report. Douglas took custody of his and Barbara's 4-year-old child. Police quickly identified that the car and clothes belonged to the same woman. A cursory inspection of the car by police revealed that the passenger's compartment had blood all over it. A closer inspection of the clothes revealed they had blood spatter on them as well. Police faithfully reconstructed the scene of Barbara's disappearance, but they had not found her or her body anywhere. 2.5 months passed without any sign of Barbara or her body. In March, a Heartland resident was entertaining guests, a couple from New York and a man from Boston. As the winter freeze was beginning to melt, the quartet went for a walk in the Vermont woods. They noticed a dark shape in the snow off to the right of the road. The two men trudged through the slushy, muddy mess being left by the spring melt. There, in a clearing next to a lone apple tree, they found a woman's body. The clothes identified the body to the residents of the town. Blue nylon bib overalls, a purple sweater. She knew instantly that this had to be the missing woman from January. The men observed a large red stain in the snow, radiating out from the woman's head and neck. The quartet quickly returned to the house and called the police. The woman's clothes had been slashed and her internal organs were protruding out of the wounds underneath the slashed clothes. With the discovery of the body, local gun shops experienced a run on handguns. Some shops reported 10 times their normal sales of handguns in the weeks after the discovery. Men were buying guns for their wives. Women were buying guns for themselves. Some women purchased mace instead, but not all of them. One woman approached a police officer, showed him the automatic handgun in her purse, and asked if he could help her learn how to use it. Another woman called the police on her son-in-law because he knocked on her door. Local hospital workers went on high alert. Barbara was a nurse, Ellen Freed was a nurse, Bernice Courtmanche and Eva Morse were both nurses' aides. It seemed they might be dealing with a psychopath who targeted healthcare workers. Local residents began calling in fresh tips on Barbara's case following the discovery of her body. Most of the tips went nowhere. But there was one man whose name kept being dropped by callers. Who is Henry Barker? Barker grew up in Vermont but now lived in New Hampshire. With the Connecticut River Valley straddling 2 states, and it being the only place in the United States where a public school system services students from 2 states, this was not an unusual move for local residents. Barker was known to local authorities from a long criminal history that stretched back into the juvenile courts. Henry's father, Donald, had been a local handyman of sorts. He helped local residents with their yard work and building maintenance for a fee. When Donald passed on, Henry began servicing some of Donald's clients. At least one of Donald's regulars was uncomfortable with Henry. His broad, muscular frame seemed intimidating. He seemed to stand just a little too close. He looked with a steady, steely stare more so than a friendly gaze, and his manner of speech seemed insinuating and sexual to her. The callers also named Crazy Eddie Strugnell. Said they saw him walking on Advent Hill Road, where Barbara's body was found. Eddie quickly admitted to being familiar with Advent Hill Road. He traveled that road to get to his employment as a window installer in Windsor. However, Eddie expressed surprise at people saying he was walking along Advent Hill Road. Eddie drove an 11-year-old Ford Fairlane that he sometimes used to cruise the back roads and drink beer alone. Eddie lived alone and spent most of his time that way. He did not go out or date very often. He didn't have a problem with women, he just didn't like going out. Detectives didn't notice anything of interest in a preliminary scan of Eddie's apartment, but they learned that he got the crazy moniker at 15. He'd been working on a TV when he got a shock from it and shot it with a shotgun. When police administered a polygraph test to Eddie, he passed it. Henry Barker came back into tighter focus after Eddie passed the polygraph test. Henry was the youngest of 6 children, raised by parents who rarely cohabitated and more allowed the children to raise themselves than actually parenting them, until his mother left the home altogether and took Henry with her. Henry preferred gym to school, resulting in a thick musculature and functional illiteracy. He was also already building a rap sheet: speeding, reckless driving, public drunkenness, a few assaults, some attacks on women, attempted sexual assault of hitchhikers. You know, all the normal stuff. Then police learned that the night Barbara disappeared, Henry had been traveling during the snowstorm offering assistance to disabled drivers in the area. It was his side gig to drive around and offer assistance to people with disabled vehicles for a fee. A few years earlier, he had picked up a hitchhiker and sexually assaulted her. State psychiatric examiners determined that Henry fit the legal definition of sane for purposes of standing trial. They also diagnosed him with psychopathic personality disorder. Having a man who admits to long hours cruising the roads in this desolate countryside, having crimes involving women taken from along those same roads and found in extremely remote locations along them, police couldn't help but put him right on top of the cesspool. The police undertook the harrowing adventure of going through the police logs, tow calls, and checking with people Henry helped on the night of Barbara's disappearance. They eventually concluded that Henry could not have committed the murder. Too much of his time was accurately accounted for by witnesses. Similarly, Richard Bordeau was ruled out as a serious suspect by John Philpin. You remember him, the psychologist who first linked the cases? Well, he's also the profiler who worked on them. He said that these crimes required too much planning and organization to have been committed by Bordeau. And so, the Connecticut River Valley killer remains mysterious and at large today. Let's wrap this video up, shall we? The main source for this video was The Shadow of Death: The Hunt for the Connecticut River Killer by Philip E. Ginsberg. The book gives in-depth histories of the main players in this story, as well as providing extensive coverage of several related crimes. I highly recommend checking it out. There's a link in the description. Much of this country is still rural. In a rural setting, there are thousands of places to leave a body where it is unlikely to be found and almost guaranteed not to be found quickly. I've lived in these areas most of my life. Right now I live in a suburb of Denver, and I can easily take you to places within a couple of miles of my home where a body can easily be hidden for a time. Also, country killers, man, they are just a special breed. There's a special type of crazy that fuels country killers. I did a series on death row inmates from rural PA a while back. Give it a watch if you don't believe me. There's links in the description. In some ways, you're safer in a city than you are in the country. I'm not going to elaborate on that. I don't think I have to. What I'd like to end by saying is this. Feral humans are among us. They hide in plain sight. They could be your neighbor. They could be you. Don't worry, you would know it if you were one of them. But anyway, until next time, lock your door. It'll make you feel better even if it doesn't help. And now, I got a jam, so tag your head. Come on. Girl. Oh. Yeah. And just chill out while I film, okay?